Asia, the idea of putting a price on carbon to drive low-carbon investment would be accepted as a good policy instrument. And BC is a leader in North America in that, but by no means in the world. I'll skip over a lot of this stuff about how they drive innovation. Trust me, they drive innovation. The OECD criticizes us regularly for being one of the countries in the world that uses these environmental tax instruments the least. We don't put a price on environmental harm. We give it away for free. Not just bad for the environment, it's bad for economic efficiency. You see this chart. This is the extent to which countries around the world use environmentally related taxes, and we're fighting for last place with the US in the OECD. So these kind of ideas that BC is a pioneer in are actually things that other developed countries are starting to move in that direction already, and good for British Columbia for following that trend. Anyway, I'll just skip over some of the stuff that... The last point, anyone here from finance departments or study fiscal issues? Because if you won't, I'm not even going to get into this stuff. The finance people love this. Anyway, we'll skip it over. Okay, so last point, what next? Let me just say a few things and we'll leave it for the discussion afterwards. So where do we go with this? Since that was half the title, I have to say something about it.
Yeah, you should say something about that.
And plus I've got Nancy's stop talking card right here,
ready.
so she can't get at it.
Yeah.
So basic one that you'd tell Gary Coleman, don't reduce the thing. That would be the worst thing to do, because you'd have all this capital investment and individual investment people have made over the last 5 years on the assumption of a carbon price that would all of a sudden be stranded and wasted. Whether you're a homeowner that's insulated your house or invested in fuel-efficient vehicles, or a company that's put in new technology, all of a sudden all the things that reward you for that behavior would reverse. So don't reverse the gains you've made at the very least. A physician do no harm. But the reality of it is if we're going to meet those BC targets, and I applaud James' optimism, most modeling suggests we need a higher carbon price, and a meaningfully higher carbon price to get there. Now, you never know. Other kinds of policies could backfill that. But if you look at the kind of prices that it takes to make things like carbon capture and sequestration cost effective, you're looking at prices of $50 and above, maybe $50 to $100, depending on the particular technology. So that's the sweet spot, right? That's the point at which all of a sudden some of the real things that are going to start creating a tipping point in terms of a low carbon economy start to become cost effective. So keep going in the direction you're on right now. Expand it. As James said, about 30% of the sources aren't covered. And to me, one of the easiest ones, the low-hanging fruit, is fugitive emissions from oil and gas development aren't covered. Right? I mean, they're not exactly in the poorhouse these days. They're a major producer of these greenhouse gases. For goodness sakes, let's start capturing the fugitive emissions that come from their development projects, and it'd be great for paying off your deficit, too. And lastly, and maybe Nick and some of the other folks who know the economics of this better than I is, I know there's real talk in the government about giving relief to some sectors that are particularly affected as the price gets higher. And you hear cement and certain kinds of agriculture, ones that are mentioned. And I'm not going to talk about whether we should or shouldn't do that, but if you're going to do it the right way. And the worst thing to do would be to exempt them from the carbon tax, because you will create people who chronically have this problem. There's no incentive to become more energy efficient once you're exempted from the tax. Do the opposite. Give every one of them a lump sum payment, maybe equivalent to the average carbon efficiency of the industry, but they still pay the tax. So companies that drive their efficiency down are actually going to make money. They'll still get the tax rebate, but if they can drive down their GHG emissions, they're actually going to come out ahead. There's still an incentive to innovate if you do that, but whatever you do, do not exempt them, or you're actually going to create the wrong signal, and you're going to entrench carbon inefficiency and energy inefficiency in those sectors. That's it.
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, we'll load Nick on.
So thanks very much. I'm Nick Rivers at the School of Public and International Affairs in Ottawa. And as Nancy said, I moved away from Vancouver about a year and a half ago. And every time I come back, I've been back a couple of times now, I hope it's raining, because it's really tears my heart out to see this place in the sun after. I got out for a run this morning on the seawall, which is great. I'm going to be talking, it's tough going third, because I'm going to be saying a lot of the same things, maybe in a little bit of a different framing than we've heard already. I've really just two main points to make. The first one is to report some of the kind of early results of a study that I've been undertaking with a colleague to try to really get a sense of what the effect of the BC carbon tax has been on retail gasoline sales in the province. And this is maybe going a little bit beyond the graphical analysis that we've seen so far. It's a statistical analysis where we try to control for what's the other potential drivers of gasoline sales. So that's the first point I'm going to make. And the second point I'm going to talk about is this idea of exemptions that Stuart finished up on. And I'm going to talk through one of the exemptions that was recently granted to the agricultural sector, to the agricultural subsector, and talk about some of the implications of that and ways to think about exemptions going forward. So like I said, the first point I want to make relates to the impact of the BC carbon tax on retail gasoline sales. And I'm studying this with a colleague. We decided to study gasoline for a few reasons. First of all, it's an important source of emissions. It's not as big as you'd think. It represents roughly a sixth of greenhouse gas emissions in the province, and roughly a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions that are covered by the BC carbon tax. But it's still an important source. It represents a highly visible source of emissions. So the one thing that people really react to when they hear about the carbon tax is the price of gas at the pump. And it's something where people all have anecdotal evidence of what they think the carbon tax has done. And probably the main reason we're looking at it is because there's actually good data available. So we have monthly data on gasoline sales in all the different provinces. And so we're able to generate some statistical inference about what the impact of the carbon tax has been. And then another nice reason to study it is because there's lots of prior study on the gasoline sector, probably because there's lots of good data, it's an important fuel. And so there's been lots and lots of studies since the late 1970s that try to identify the impact of price changes on gasoline demand. So we're going to draw on some of those studies. I'll give you a sense of what those studies say. And this goes to that figure that Stuart showed earlier. Most studies suggest that the responsiveness of consumers to gasoline price changes is fairly limited. And so economists would say that gasoline demand is fairly inelastic. It doesn't change a lot with changing prices. However, there is a much bigger long-run response than short-run response. And so in the lingo, a short-run response refers to the period when your equipment is kind of fixed and your big decisions about where to live and where to work are kind of fixed. And so the margin you have for changing your gasoline consumption is things like changing the mode of transport, getting into a bike versus getting into a car, or changing the distance you drive. You can't change the car or you can't change your workplace. When economists talk about the long-run gasoline response, they're talking about those big decisions, changing the type of car you're going to drive or changing your workplace, that kind of thing. And so again, the short-run response, as you'd imagine, is pretty limited, and the long-run response is a little bit bigger. And so if we take the results from these kind of previous studies and apply them to the BC carbon tax, we get a sense that this literature would show a pretty small response to the carbon tax so far, and definitely not in proportion to the figures that were shown earlier. And so if you take that short-run response from these previous studies of gasoline price changes on gasoline demand, you get somewhere about maybe around a 1% reduction in gasoline sales that would be attributed to the price change. And if you're looking more at the long-run response, you might get a 1.5 or 2% reduction in gasoline sales. And so this is pretty limited, and it's not really commensurate with the evidence that we're seeing. I wanted to point to a couple of other recent studies that have indicated that consumers respond quite differently to what we call idiosyncratic price changes or just general price fluctuations than they do to tax-induced changes. And so there's been two major efforts by really prominent researchers at some of the big U.S. schools to study the way that consumers respond to changes in excise taxes, which is the way that states implement their gasoline taxes, and to compare those to kind of the way that consumers respond to idiosyncratic fluctuations in the gasoline price, say driven by crude oil price changes. And they've found that the response to these tax changes is way, way bigger than it is to these idiosyncratic price changes. And so the one study out of Berkeley in Michigan found that consumers have reduced their gasoline demand 5 times more vigorously when faced with the new excise tax than they have when faced with just a general fluctuation in the price of gasoline. The study that I've got here from Harvard and Cornell researchers suggests that the response to tax change is even bigger than that, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 times as big as an idiosyncratic price change. And so then we're getting to numbers that are more commensurate with the numbers we're seeing from that Stuart and James presented. We're seeing that if you translate these figures into the BC context, you might expect to see a 5 or 6% reduction in BC gasoline sales as a result of the carbon tax. There's a few reasons that are thrown up to explain this. Some of the ones that I think are reasonable are the idea of salience. And so the idea that these tax changes are often accompanied by really big media coverage. Gasoline's a sensitive issue. And so it really it causes people to reevaluate their transportation decisions and to respond in a more informed way, perhaps, or enlightened way than they would to an idiosyncratic price change. If prices kind of steadily climbed for no obvious reason, the argument goes that people are less likely to switch their types of vehicle they're driving or switch their major transportation choices than if there's a lot of media that covers that comes out around something like a carbon tax or an excise tax change. Another big explanation is to do with expectations. People buy a car; they're driven. The type of car they buy is driven by what their expectation of future gas prices are going to be. And if it's a tax change, you get a sense that the price change is going to be a permanent tax change or permanent price change. Whereas if it's just a general fluctuation in the crude oil market, you really have no idea. And so that signal generates a stronger signal for consumers to respond to. And so, kind of driven by this literature, we've undertaken a study of the BC carbon tax. We've got monthly data, so we have quite a lot higher resolution data than was presented in the earlier studies. And so the figure on the right-hand side here is just a snapshot of some of the monthly data we have covering BC gasoline sales over the last 20 years. And what we're trying to do is measure the difference between that black line and that red line that I've drawn, which would be BC gasoline sales without the carbon tax. The problem, of course, is that we don't observe that red line. We can't tell what BC gasoline sales would have been without that carbon tax. And so we have to go with a kind of statistical methodology, which is similar to the other work that looks at estimating this gasoline demand. So we compare what's happened in BC in a formal way to what's happened in BC in previous time periods, as well as what's happened in other provinces over the same time period and over previous time periods. And we try to control for other factors that would have influenced gasoline sales over that whole time period, so things like income or price of crude oil, excise taxes, the type of vehicles that are in play. And our estimate, and I can certainly send the paper to anyone who would like to see it, is that at $30 a ton, we believe that BC's carbon tax has caused around a 7% reduction in gasoline demand. And so much bigger than would be suggested by this empirical literature that I mentioned earlier, and maybe not quite as big as the full extent of the change that we've witnessed in gasoline sales over that period. So that's the first kind of item that I wanted to talk about, that we think we've been able to identify a causal effect of the BC gasoline tax, or the BC carbon tax on gasoline sales. The second one is this is a 90-degree turn now. I want to talk about exemptions and rebating the revenues from the carbon tax. And so, as we all know, BC's budget announced a review of the carbon tax with a particular focus on competitiveness and on the agricultural sector. You saw the wording around the review that James presented earlier. And very shortly after the review, I think it was after, I think I got my timelines right, the BC government made an announcement that there would be a temporary annual 1 year 7.6 million rebate to the greenhouse sector. And so basically they were refunding the payments that the greenhouse sector had made in their carbon tax payments. And this was in response to lobbying from the greenhouse sector that the carbon tax had worsened their international competitiveness. And so the stated aim of this rebate is, I've got up here from, the first one's from the Ministry of Agriculture, in basically saying that the BC's greenhouse sector will receive $7.6 million from the province in carbon tax relief, allowing producers to focus on their competitive edge, so to make them more competitive. And the second one's from the Greenhouse Growers Association, saying that with this carbon tax rebate, BC growers will be able to better compete with other producers. And so again, this is an exemption to the existing carbon tax, and that's what I wanted to get at in the rest of this talk. So if you go to the economic theory that talks about tax base and about carbon taxes in particular, the evidence suggests that exemptions are a poor way to maintain the competitiveness of an industry. Basically, what an exemption does, if we're talking about meeting these fixed targets, basically what an exemption does is it narrows the tax base and it forces the rate to increase for all the other sectors to hit the same target. And this is exactly the opposite of what we think is good tax practice. Paul Ryan in the U.S. has been talking about broaden the base, lower the rate, broaden the base, lower the rate, and that's essentially what I'm saying here. That for the carbon tax, the economically efficient way to go about things will be to cover as many sectors as possible with this, rather than to force all the effort on a smaller subsector of the sectors and force them to do more, because you'll be missing opportunities, in this case from the Greenhouse Association. And so this is a quote that I presented here from a German study of carbon tax exemptions. The Germans, Mikhail might be able to tell us more about this, we're struggling with the idea of carbon tax exemptions around 1997, I think. And this quote here suggests the results here presented here confirm standard intuition from the public finance and taxation literature, which suggests that exemptions can significantly increase the welfare cost of taxes. Exemptions may retain jobs in subsidized sectors, but these jobs are expensive for society as a whole. Our calculations suggest that there may be far less costly methods of retaining employment in specific industries. So again, if you want to retain employment in the greenhouse sector, and that's a perfectly legitimate goal, there's probably better ways to go about it than exempting them from the carbon tax. And this brings me to another kind of rule of thumb in economics, which is have as many policy instruments as you have objectives. And in this case, we seem to have multiple objectives. We want to reduce emissions, but we also we seem to want to maintain international competitiveness and maybe profits in certain sectors. And the rule of thumb that I'm describing here says don't try to make the carbon tax do all that at once by creating exemptions. Instead, levy the carbon tax on all sectors and create these specific targeted measures to address the other issues that you might have, profits and industrial and competitiveness. And so Stuart mentioned that one way to go about maintaining profits for certain industries is to afford them lump sum transfers, and so basically to compensate them for lost profits. And that way the incentive to reduce emissions is still there from the carbon tax, and you use another instrument to address this profitability issue, this distributional issue that's caused that seems to be a concern for government. If international competitiveness is an issue, a lump sum payment's not going to address that. A lump sum payment doesn't affect any decision, shouldn't really affect decisions at the margin. It's basically a transfer to these shareholders of whatever company you're talking about. So a way to actually address this international competitiveness issue would be to subsidize sectors, potentially in a similar way to what Stuart described, to make their cost of producing output less, so that they're more able to compete with international competitors. And so if competitiveness is an issue, again, the message is don't exempt them from a carbon tax. Bring another measure in that finds a way to address the particular issue you have. And my final suggestion on this exemptions and revenue recycling discussion is that there seems to be a need for a really clear set of rules for defining what is a negatively affected sector or what is a negatively affected industry, so that this doesn't end up becoming an annual subject of lobbying and negotiation. The numbers that I've put up here come out of the Waxman-Markey bill, which was the big climate bill that almost made it through the U.S. Senate in 2010. And they had measures that were set up as the bill was built to say, well, these are sectors that we think were likely to be negatively affected. They're ones that send a lot of their production overseas, so they're trade exposed. And they're also ones that spend a lot of that have a fairly high cost share for energy, so they're potentially likely to have costs go up. And so this Waxman-Markey bill said, let's create a list of these sectors, and we're not going to negotiate with anyone else. We're going to have this list of sectors, and we'll afford them some compensation using the kind of mechanisms I described here, and we'll maintain the carbon tax. In their case, it was a cap and trade system whole. So that's all I have to say. I'll just reiterate my two main points. It looks to me like we can attribute a causal effect to the carbon tax in terms of gasoline sales, and our estimates are that it's about 7%. And the second point was that exemptions, to me, are a poor way to address issues related to competitiveness or profitability. There's much more effective tools for addressing those issues than to exempt them from carbon taxes.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Nick.
Hello. I'd really like to commend you for these results you've presented here. I think if you will be presenting these figures also in the conference the next 2 days, I think they will attract a lot of attention. I think the BC tax is probably one of the best designed carbon taxes across the world, and I think a lot of attention should really be paid to the experiences coming from here. Having said that, I've been asked now to give a final contribution to the panel, and now other speakers have been going into quite some detail on the BC case, and so the rest of the world I will now deal with. For this,
In 15 minutes.
I've been allowed 3 more minutes, I think,
18 minutes.
than the other speakers. So, but I think, I mean, it's in the discussion in all countries that there's a global dimension of the carbon and greenhouse gas problem, and the competitiveness issues that we're concerned about are, of course, very closely tied with that global dimension. So what I want to do now is that I'll briefly mention the developments on carbon energy taxation in the tailwind of the Copenhagen Accord. I'll give you some of the findings from the study that was referred to before from these taxes in Europe. And then I'll look a bit into the future and put some options on the table as to how we might move from this unilateral carbon energy taxation into some type of diplomacy that could entice emerging economies to also join a regime of unilateral carbon energy taxation. And I think border tax adjustments here can play a key role. Let's not forget that the problem that we're facing is quite big, and the chance to meet this 2-degree target is not very good unless we really go for a dramatic stabilization target. The green reduction curve here gives us a 75% chance of meeting the 2%, the 2-degree target. But we shouldn't forget that in actual fact we are on one of the steep red curves that you see to the upper left, because emissions have been increasing rapidly. Before COP15, we learned that US and China were equally the 2 big global emitters. But please, on the lower graph there, pay attention to the big increase in China's emissions. I know it's sometimes politically incorrect to emphasize the Chinese emissions, but I'll do it nevertheless, because China's emissions have been growing much faster than anticipated by the IPCC. And the doubling of China's emissions, which you can see in that lower curve, which came through in just less than 8 years, was projected to happen only in 2025. So came through much quicker than expected. And when we take the most recent figures, we can now see China is indeed the largest global emitter, with more than a quarter of global emissions, and the US having declined a bit. So I think this was what happened in Copenhagen, that China emerged there with the other emerging economies as a very influential player in the global talks on climate change policy. And I think they had been underestimated in the whole process leading up to COP15. However, in the absence of a binding international agreement, it was agreed that countries would report their domestic measures, and we have seen there in the tailwind of COP15 that many countries have reported measures also making use of carbon energy taxation. In Australia, the fall of Kevin Rudd's government indeed was related to the proposed cap-and-trade scheme, and with the Greens there in a pivotal position, what has emerged has in fact now been agreed as a type of a carbon tax that maybe later on will develop into a cap-and-trade scheme. We have seen the CO2 tax introduced here in Canada, in British Columbia, and also in some other provinces. We've also seen Japan agree a carbon tax earlier this year. It's a lower rate than the rate here in Canada, but it comes on top of pre-existing energy taxes. And we will have a paper in the conference clarifying exactly the nature of the Japanese scheme. We see a growing resentment against the cap-and-trade schemes. Also in the U.S., one person there who has spoken out against the cap-and-trade scheme was Michael Porter, who says that this cap-and-trade model that has been patched together is far too complicated and blunts incentives that would enhance innovation and competitiveness. A carbon tax would lead to a rethinking of energy use, drive innovation in the green economy, and yield profits for first movers. This, he said, 2 years ago, but I think in Europe we can confirm this skepticism because we have seen their prices for carbon permits plummet. There's an oversupply of these permits, and there's a volatility related to the carbon price with cap and trade that doesn't provide that stable signal that investors are looking for in the market for renewables. And also China is indeed discussing carbon taxation and have on the table proposals for carbon taxation. It was on the table when the 12th five-year plan was agreed last year. I was myself a member of a task force of international experts advising the Chinese government on experiences with carbon taxation. And the aim of the Chinese is to introduce some type of carbon pricing over the next five-year plan period. But whether they will in the end opt for taxes or cap and trade is still quite open. Now, having said this, that a lot of countries are considering carbon taxes, and some have also introduced it already. What do tax experts say about carbon taxation? Well, if we consider carbon taxation under the broader umbrella of ETR, which means environmental tax reform, the shifting of the tax burden away from labor, being substituted then by carbon taxes and other environmentally related taxes, there is a consensus in the literature that if you have this type of full revenue recycling, then this can imply a chance for some type of double dividend, especially if these taxes replace other distortionary taxes. And then the debate goes on, what are those distortionary taxes? There's been a lot of concern about energy-intensive industries, but it's important to remember that being energy-intensive is not the same as to be trade-intensive, and this has to do with the ratio between the weight and value of products in some sectors. In the ComETR project, we used historical data and statistical analysis to map which are the sensitive sectors, and especially basic metals comes out as a sector that's sensitive as well to foreign price influences, as also being very energy intensive. Whereas cement, which is in this category of non-metallic mineral products, while it's very energy intensive, it's actually not so trade intensive because the product is very heavy and is not so easily transported as many other products. So there are some differences that have to be taken into account. But in this project, we used quite some econometric techniques to disentangle the impacts of the carbon energy taxes, which had been introduced in 7 European countries. And like you saw also for the BC tax, it's possible to identify the impact there on total fuel demand for these countries. And there was an overall decline of about 4 to 5% in most of these countries, Slovenia being the exception, because in Slovenia they only renamed some taxes into carbon taxes but didn't really change the tax burden. So if you make only a symbolic exercise, you don't have much of an impact there. The reduction in greenhouse gases that came through was slightly bigger because of changes and fuel shifting across sectors. So overall, here the impact was bigger and also differs between countries, with the biggest impacts coming through in Sweden and Finland. These also being the countries having the lesser exemptions than some of the other countries in question here. Now, of course, the big issue has been whether there is a double dividend from environment taxation or whether there are rather negative impacts from introducing carbon taxes. The study here could not identify negative impacts from carbon energy taxes. Quite on the contrary, most of the countries, for most of the countries, the study indicates a small positive impact on GDP as a result of the tax shifting, because labor being less taxed becomes a more attractive production factor. With the modeling, we can also tease out and simulate what would have happened if there had not been revenue recycling and if there had not been a shifting of the tax burden, but simply another tax being added as a carbon tax. And in that worst case scenario, the impacts are more neutral, but again, there's no finding of a strong negative impact of introducing carbon energy taxes in these European countries. It's also possible with this study to compare trends in those countries that had environmental tax reform and those EU member states that did not have such tax reforms. And it's not possible to identify similar effects in the non-reformed countries. Finally, in the issue of carbon leakage, yes, the study does identify some small amount of carbon leakage. The rate of about 2 to 4% in fact corresponds well to other studies, for instance, from the International Energy Agency, which have reported rather high leakage rates, but also for much higher tax rates than the tax rates.
Doesn't know what carbon leakage is. Not what it might sound like at first blush.
Okay, but carbon leakage is basically kind of a lingo for the fact that happens that if you introduce a carbon tax unilaterally, that business will just move abroad, or the production of those products will move abroad, and so the carbon emissions will just take place elsewhere. That's the phenomenon of carbon leakage. So overall, we can see that ETR contributed to a reduction of CO2 emissions in these European countries of 60 million tons, and this is actually a significant contribution, more than 20% of the EU 15 Kyoto target. Now, I show you these results from a model, and a good question is, should we trust this model? First of all, I would like to stress that here we use the historical data for the responses in the member states. So it's based on actual time series data, whereas much of the modeling that we've seen elsewhere, and in particular coming from US studies, is far more theoretical and based also on models that cannot always capture the kind of fuel shifting that takes place when you have carbon taxes. And there's a very high representation of the different sectors in this model. The model which has been used, the so-called E3ME model, is also an officially recognized model that the European Union uses again and again for assessment purposes. So to sum up, what is the key political problem for such tax shifting? Because as we may conclude from the figures, it's actually not really an economic problem at the level of a country. The political problem is that these energy-intensive industries that are maybe only 20% of all businesses, these energy-intensive industries consume perhaps 60% of all energy. And because these energy-intensive industries are usually not very labor-intensive, when you then shift the tax burden, they don't win quite as much as they lose. So at company level, a revenue-neutral tax shifting will not be neutral, and there will be winners and losers when you introduce carbon taxes. But how much do they lose, these energy-intensive industries? This we could also quantify in this study. And here we look at 4 of the really energy-intensive sectors, being glass, cement, steel, and non-ferrous metals. And yes, the blue bar there shows the negative impact on the gross operating surplus. up to 5% for steel and non-ferrous metals. That might be the figure that company managers see immediately on their account sheet. But what they should also factor in is the value of the lowered payroll tax, and they should also factor in that part of energy saving that can be referred to the impact of the energy tax. So when you consider there the green bar, you will see that the costs of the tax shifting exercise is actually somewhat lower than what, let's say, the quick and dirty inspection of company accounts by the manager may reveal. So the largest cost we could identify was still only in the magnitude of 2% of gross operating surplus in these industries, which is not a major cost, I think, for a climate change policy. And we had the same result as also in the BC tax, that energy taxes provide higher response than just fluctuations in energy prices. And I think there was a very good explanation provided before, so I will not go more into that. In this whole literature on competitiveness, there is something which is called the Kaldor paradox on competitiveness, and this is the paradox that actually it is not so much always unit labor costs that explain why some countries are more competitive than others, but it is much more about research and development and technological capacity. And our thinking is that these carbon energy taxes, in fact, improve research and development and new product lines, and by improving productivity, this actually may explain how this increase in GDP comes about, and also how the test of international markets are being met. So, having said this about the positive impacts of carbon energy taxes, let me then close with some thinking about how we can get China and other emerging economies on board, and also find a way that would trigger the introduction of carbon and energy taxes in these countries. And first of all, it has to be said that China itself is very keen to explore this, because the major bottleneck for China is actually energy supply. That's the major bottleneck for their economic growth. But their 5-year plan is aiming for a quadrupling of their GDP within the next 10 years, while they only want to tolerate a doubling of their energy consumption. But even with such an type of energy efficiency policy, you will see that CO2 emissions in China are bound to increase even further. I showed you in the historical map how it had already doubled once, but it's bound to double again, even with the best designed energy efficiency policies. So something has to happen, because something must happen, because this is not sustainable. Their position in the climate negotiations has been somewhat awkward. You know all the well-known arguments about the historical responsibility of the old industrialized countries, and China claims there to have still a right to development. However, having worked in an expert task force with some of these Chinese experts, I can report that many of the technocrats there are very well aware of the challenges as well in energy efficiency as in climate change policy. And then when it comes to their to NDRC, their planning unit, their 3,000-man planning unit, and also the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment, actually I think there's a good understanding of how a greening of the economy can be made. The real problem is with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, which was the unit that was responsible for the negotiations, because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there is the last stronghold of the Marxists. But with the Ministry of Finance and the Planning Authority, there you do not find any Marxist economists, only good economists educated at U.S. universities.
It's the secret plan.
We have to find a way to work with those people who are thinking along the same lines as us in China.